legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Jasun Horsley, who joins us to discuss his book, The Vice of Kings, How Socialism, Occultism and the Sexual Revolution Engineered a Culture of Abuse. In today's post-truth world, we are becoming inundated with fantasy fiction, alternate truth, fake news and grossly oversimplified, wildly exaggerated conspiracy theories in which cryptocratic power structures and shadowy elites rule our fates. But suppose the truth is both stranger than any fiction and more nuanced and disturbing than any theory. Suppose it is not conspiracy, but complicity that creates our world. Beginning as an investigation into the author's childhood inside a closet aristocracy of so-called progressive British entrepreneurs, The Vice of Kings uncovers a shocking and deeply disturbing history with links to powerful, high-profile individuals and organisations within the media, entertainment, government, law enforcement, the intelligence services and more. By juxtaposing disc jockey Jimmy Savile's secret cultural, criminal and political affiliations in the second half of the 20th century with the life and teachings of Aleister Crowley in the first, it uncovers an alarming body of evidence suggesting that organised child abuse is not only the dark side of occultism, but the shadowy secret at the heart of culture, both ancient and modern. Hello and welcome, Jasun, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks, Greg.
Today, Jasun, we're going to be talking about your new book, The Vice of Kings, How Socialism, Occultism and the Sexual Revolution Engineered a Culture of Abuse. Before we dive into that, for listeners who don't know, tell us just a little bit about your work as a writer, the background to this new book, because it's, to say the least, very personal.
Yeah, well, how would I even begin there? So I've been writing pretty much my whole life. I started out writing about movies, and even my first published books were about movies. And in 2013, I think it was, I started a book called Seen and Not Seen, Confessions of a Movie Autist, which was going back, looking back over my previous film writings, The Blood Poets, and kind of using them as a template to understand myself better. So psychoanalyzing myself through my lifelong obsession with movies. And that led to me looking into the life and death of my brother, Jasun Horsley, kind of unexpectedly. As I was nearing the end of the book, I just found myself drawn to look into my brother's life and try to understand how and why he had died. He died of a heroin overdose in 2010. And there were just a lot of indications that the reasons for his death were not understood by anyone in his family or anyone in the world. And that led me to obviously look into my brother's past, which was my own past, and by extension into our father's and our paternal grandfather's past. And I began to find out some quite surprising things about my family history and my ancestry, and some surprising overlaps, because well, I say that I started writing about movies, that's true, but I also had a parallel interest which was in the hidden side of our culture and our society in terms of deep politics, conspiracies, the occult, those sorts of subjects. So I was also writing about those subjects, but very separate from my film writing. And with Seen and Not Seen, the two kind of collided. But most surprisingly of all, they collided over the kind of raised earth of my own family history. And so that led to a series of essays that was called Occult Yorkshire, which I did in my blog, looking into the Fabian Society to begin with because of the connection that had to my paternal grandfather. Like he was one of the founding Fabians in our local area of England, which was Hull, Kingston upon Hull. And that was the proverbial rabbit hole. Like I'd heard about the Fabian Society, and I'd heard about them in the context of conspiracy theories and whatnot, but I'd never taken the time to look into it. I only did so because of this personal connection. And what I found was quite startling and remarkable, and it led to the first part of the Vice of Kings, and all of the different connections I uncovered there. And then, as you know, the second part was a kind of separate examination of the life and work of Aleister Crowley, which related to a lifelong interest that I'd had myself in Crowley. Well, maybe not lifelong, but from my early 20s. And because of the obvious correlations and intersects between what I discovered to be the occult underlayer of British society via my research into the Fabian Society, the obvious overlap between that and Crowley being probably the most influential occultist of the 20th century.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the Fabian Society and Fabianism, what that is for people who don't know, in due course, and we'll come on to Crowley in due course as well. Let's just say, I mean, what you've been outlining basically is that prior to this book, perhaps, but certainly as you started to put it together, the writings for it, you began to unearth a network, shall we say, of people, places, events, ideas that encompass the media, entertainment sectors, government, law enforcement, intelligence services, encompassing high-ranking individuals and organizations as well, influential people, powerful people, what some people refer to as the elite. And you mentioned the term conspiracy a couple of minutes ago, and what I'm outlining here may sound familiar to a lot of people, but I found in your book, and I've spent a long time looking at these things myself, but your book, the fact that it is so personal and it involves your family history, lends it a different quality, in my opinion, to a lot of writers who have spoken about this sort of network in disinterested terms almost, but the fact that your family, that you discovered through looking back into their past, as you say, which is your own past, that these connections started to appear. Your book read very differently to the reams and reams of other things, books and, websites, events, talks I've been to where people are discussing these same things.
Yeah, well, I understand. I mean, it's easy to get disoriented in this field and trying to map the exact difference that you're talking about there for myself as the author, because I'd spent decades researching conspiracy, and the fact that at a certain point I ended up researching the same subjects while I thought I was just looking into my own personal history was obviously a shock, and it required a completely different approach, of course. Like the degree of sensitivity that I was suddenly having to handle this material with was radically different. Previously, it had been an intellectual exercise. And what I discovered, of course, very early on, and what I was actually looking to discover, somewhat consciously and somewhat unconsciously, was why had I been drawn to conspiracy research in the first place, in the same way I was trying to figure out why I was so driven to write about movies. And of course, the answers, as always with these things, it came back to childhood formative experiences, and in both cases to trauma. And well, of course, that's the underlying theme of Vice of Kings, as well as my previous books, Seen and Not Seen and Prisoner Infinity, that the unifying principle of control that is generally, I would say, oversimplified in conspiracy theory is, I think, traumatization, whether it's local or global. And when we're dealing with trauma, it's an incredibly sensitive issue. It's not entertainment. It's not intellectual fodder. It's not mere historical research. It's psychotherapy. I mean, it's what psychotherapy is potentially anyway is geared and shaped to help us to heal. So, and this was a trajectory in my own writing from seen and not seen to date, was that I was becoming more conscious of the need for me to write as a therapeutic aid, as a means to discover, some sort of wholeness or restore some sort of wholeness to my own psyche. So, that, I think that, I mean, that's much more serious an affair. We can think of mapping world conspiracies as a very serious business. And of course, people who write about it do. But, it isn't really that serious compared to, trying to restore one's psyche to wholeness and balance. Like that's one's whole life depends on that. And, what I found with conspiracy research and what I've always found, but writing in this way made me more acutely aware of, is that it is very, intellect based. And it's, well, now I'm going to risk getting garbled, but there's something about what I try to uncover with these recent books is that, and I include it in the summary of conspiracy is not necessarily the correct term when we begin to understand the reach of these, agendas or these philosophies and the extent to which they engender complicity. Thereby we become a part of the apparent conspiracies that we're uncovering. And at a certain point I had to recognize that yes, there were all these players and all of these agendas that fit all the sort of main, dots, or that reproduce the main dots that some of the more well-known conspiracy theorists have been propagating, but that I was included in the forces that I was uncovering. I was actually a player within that, and I'd become complicit with them, and the way in which that I was trying to map and deconstruct these agendas was itself engendered in me by the forces I was trying to map. So in other words, the kind of thinking that I had been using to understand conspiracy, in quote, was the same kind of thinking that the, in quote, conspiracy had engendered in me. It's very complicated, very difficult to talk about, but the simplest way to say is this whole idea of us and them that is central to most conspiracy theories is inherently incorrect, I think, but paradoxically it's sort of part of the conspiracy is to make us think in these terms of us and them.
Yes, I think that's a really important point in understanding conspiracy theory and theorists. I say it is difficult to express. I can only suggest that people basically read your book to get a better grasp on that if they don't feel they have. So the network that I spoke of, and I'm using that word just for want of a better one, let's call it a shadow network. Let's use a term that a conspiracy theorist might use. One of the things I think understood by anybody who spent any time looking at conspiracy theory is that it's spoken about often as like an underground thing behind the scenes, as it were, but hidden in plain sight is probably a better phrase to use. And we haven't used the term, we haven't touched upon the dimension of this, which is, it's in the title of your book, Culture of Abuse. Sexual abuse, specifically that of minors, is a core theme here. I mentioned this to bring into the discussion Jimmy Savile. Mm-hmm. Now he is a high profile individual who you write about extensively in the book, who exemplifies this sort of double existence, this a public life that is one thing and a private life that is something quite different. He is an interesting case because I think up to that point, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but up to that point in my life anyway, and we're of similar age, so up to this point in my life, I don't remember anyone such a high-profile person who was lionized and lauded in their lifetime being undone in such a spectacular fashion by revelations after their death, their reputation being trashed. But it's also interesting for me because I find myself questioning everything that I'd thought about the entertainment industry in general, but Jimmy Savile specifically, because I was of that generation who grew up with Jim'll Fix It. And this guy was on TV constantly, not just with his own shows, but his charity work. He was all over the place. He was hobnobbing with royalty. He had a New Year's honour at one point. Was the OBE or whatever MB? Who cares really? It's just some letters. But he was rewarded by the establishment, shall we say, for his work. And I, not to pat myself on the back, but I questioned him from the start in my own mind. And it wasn't because I thought there was anything, that I actually had any reason to think there was something nefarious going on, but I initially just wondered what actually is this guy's talent. I thought he's not, there was a time when ostensibly unattractive people could be movie stars and pop stars and what have you. These days they like people to be much prettier, don't they? David Beckham sort of look, or Tom Cruise, or whatever it happens to be, George Clooney. They like people to look a certain way, and Jimmy Savile had none of that. I just couldn't establish what his actual talent was and why he had such a high profile. And I think that and this is something I had to question myself, to why because I thought I was seeing things very clearly and being very honest with myself. When all these revelations came out about him, and again, people that must know about Jimmy Savile. If you don't, just look up on the internet, just go to the Wikipedia page on Jimmy Savile and you'll see how the whole thing panned out. I asked myself, I thought there was something fishy about it, but it was only because I thought that, I don't know what it was, but I wasn't surprised by the revelations, but at the same time, I didn't see that coming. So I had to ask some questions about myself and how I perceive things and what was I compartmentalizing? What was I suppressing in my own mind?
Well, maybe this is an example then of what we were talking about earlier, which is there's a broad stroke conspiracy theory, which I refer to it as first and second matrix. So we've got the first matrix, which is the consensus reality, which in this case is that Jimmy Savile is, just a DJ and a charity worker and so on, and a nice guy. And then the second matrix is the alternate perceptions, which is growing more and more in the mainstream, which tends to be overcompensatory. Like it's so difficult to reconcile the truth about whoever it is, in this case Jimmy Savile, with the illusion that we're under for so long, that there's a tendency to either sweep it under the rug, which is the general thing. That's what the first matrix, what the consensus tries to do, and just say, he was a bad apple, and, there was poor security in place, and so on, and it was the 70s, and come up with all these rationalizations to just sweep it under the rug and forget it happened. Or on the other hand, there's the David Icke, approach, which is to extrapolate from this very broad stroke idea, that ends up with the society is kind of like the scenario and they live. It's all geared towards large scale mind control, and that we're all being brainwashed, and that we're actually in this completely or metaphorically anyway, this fabricated fake reality, and can't actually see what's going on because of these advanced methods of mind control and so on and so forth. Well, I'm probably all familiar with this idea, even if it's just from movies. Now, the truth seems to be somewhere in between the two. Like, why I talk about the second matrix is if you oversimplify the truth as a way to, as a sort of compensatory mechanism, like you've had your previous version of reality has been destroyed by facts around whatever it is, Jimmy Savile in this case, and if you can't just sweep it all under the rug, then our tendency is to scramble, and to, sort of clutch at all the straws we can reach to assemble a new interpretation of reality that, however, threatening and however sinister it is, at least we feel that we understand what's going on. we don't like to stay in this liminal space of as what you were just saying, how could we be so compartmentalized? How could we be so wrong about Jimmy Savile? And turn the lens on ourselves and really look at the ways in which we might still be deluded. We prefer to go from one belief system to another. So, what I've been trying to explore with my recent books is, how is it possible? How is it possible that we could be so wrong about the society we live in that, and I'm attempting this in a recent series also called Psychological Operatives in Hollywood, because it constantly bugs me on a day-to-day basis. I mean, bugs is putting it mildly. Like, I enjoy watching movies, I enjoy watching TV shows, but I'm more and more aware of what's going on behind the scenes in the entertainment industry, and it creates this never-ending cognitive dissonance between the perception I have of the entertainment industry and its products as a consumer and the perception I have as a researcher. And so I'm constantly trying to bridge these two worlds, and it's a never-ending challenge. And it's not sufficient for me to just say, well, they're all, satanic pedophiles who belong to the Illuminati, and they're all mind control Manchurian candidates, and we're just under the spell of magicians and sorcerers. That doesn't satisfy me as an explanation. I'm sure it doesn't satisfy you either. So then I'm looking for a much deeper, more nuanced and more intimate and personal understanding of how it is that we have been traumatized and fragmented and have dissociated into these sort of perceptual matrices where we're actually not perceiving what's happening in front of our eyes. Because I do believe that is the case, but that a science fiction or a over-exaggerated conspiracy theory scenario around that doesn't help us to understand what's happening. It's just an oversimplified compensatory narrative to make us feel that we still know what's going on, even though we've admitted that we didn't know what was going on until we adopted the new David Icke worldview.
Yes, I mean, we were talking about the archetypal conspiracy researcher a few minutes ago, and David Icke certainly fits the bill. I mean, surely he must be the number one. I don't know if you have, but I've met David Icke a number of times. I worked with him for about a year. I found him to be a genuine guy. He's just a human being. When I first spoke to him, he was eating a ham sandwich and he had his mouth full of that. But he spoke with his mouth full and that was fine, and he apologized for it. Point in mentioning this is that I found him to be just a bloke, which is how he likes to portray himself, if you see in-person interviews with him. When he presents his material, I think that he is trying to present an all-encompassing worldview, kind of a worldview that answers all questions. And each individual segment of one of his presentations, for example, is interesting in itself. He might talk about politics or the economic system or the education system, and he may talk about Saturn and cosmic rays, and it's all interesting. It's all fascinating. But when he puts it all together, I think it's overwhelming, and I think that he would have probably gained more traction with the mainstream, if not the media, then certainly with the population, if he narrowed it down a little bit and honed it a little bit more. But again, he's presenting the world and the life, the universe and everything as he sees it. But I do think that's a problem with a lot of people who sense that there's something up. Yeah, they look out the window, they look on TV and go, yeah, there's something wrong with this. It's a bit like you mentioned They Live or The Matrix. Somebody just said, I don't, because I went through this as a child. There's something not quite right about this. What is it? But to then to say, aha, I found the master key and here it is. It's too simplistic and, it's not satisfying and I don't think it answers the questions, basically echoing what you said a moment ago.
Yeah, well, it's polarizing also, and we're seeing that in the culture now and in the society. And I think as within, so without, that it's an internal polarization that then gets materialized or exteriorized outside on a collective level. So, as I say, if we try and come up with if basically we need this sort of all-inclusive worldview, as you say, that we get conditioned with as children. We feel we need it to survive, obviously, to function in society and to advance within society as we're programmed or conditioned to do. We rely on that all-inclusive worldview and the general belief that it's shared, it's consensual. As that starts to come apart, it's an inevitable reflex or reaction to try and create a new all-inclusive worldview to replace the one that we're losing. And so that's already a split in ourselves, because it doesn't really work. We create two opposing worldviews, and neither of them are fully satisfactory. They can be used to oppose each other and perhaps cancel each other out, but that's a really terrifying idea, because then we end up with no worldview at all, right? So generally we just move back and forth from one to the other if we can't just stay hunkered down in the one, right? So I think, as I say, that's also reflected outside of us. We're seeing more and more polarization in the world. And so somebody like David Icke or Alex Jones is another obvious famous example, is popular precisely for that reason. Like they're appealing to a certain demographic that's emigrating, as it were, from the primary consensus to this secondary consensus, and thereby helping to create it. And then that creates that opposition or that polarization within society, and the two reinforce each other. They kind of prop each other up.
Yeah, that's a very important point. That I don't think I've really articulated that before about the two. They really do feed each other. Let me put another point to you from what you just said about the not knowing. You're going from this primary matrix to a secondary one. People are migrating from one to the other. That's increasing. We have, and this is a point I've made many times in interviews here, is that human beings have a sort of a really innate need for a worldview that's coherent. I found that as what the worldview that I was sent packing with when I was a child off to school, there's your lunch, there's your worldview, enjoy. As the worldview started to come apart, and I was trying to grasp for understanding of that and pieces of, okay, well, if that's not the case, then what is the case? Although I've spent a long time trying to, reach for that meaning and understanding, at the end of every day, it's like, okay, another day when I don't really know what's going on. And it's not through want of trying, but I'm comfortable with that. In fact, I get quite playful with it at times, and so it makes me laugh sometimes. So I really don't know what's going on. Life, the universe, and everything. Don't ask me. So how have you felt about that over the trajectory of your life? Not so much in the context of your book and your writing, obviously, all these very personal issues, but in the sort of, how can I put it, the intellectual dimension of your life where you've been considering meaning and existence, are you comfortable with not knowing, more or less comfortable than you used to be in the past?
Yeah, well, I'm laughing because it's kind of my brand now, the liminality or liminalism, even as kind of active participation in liminality, which is, another way of saying that to me would be not knowing, like accepting a condition of not knowing, the liminal realm being, the space between. So again, we've left one worldview, but we've resisted the urge to just dive right into another worldview that's ready made for us. We just stay on the threshold, until we do know, and maybe we never will. I mean, maybe that's all we can know is that we can't know anything. Of course, it's a total cliche. And so I don't want to get stuck in a cliche either, because then it becomes, well, obviously it's a self-contradicting thing anyway, so one can have conviction about not having convictions and so on, right? So what I would say that has become more tangibly real to me, rather than just this intellectual position of, okay, I will admit that I don't know, is that there is something in me that can know, but it cannot be translated into mentalized concepts. Like, as long as I'm referring to concepts or to intellectual models or constructs, then I'm leaving the awareness or the experience of knowing. Now, I can know something in my body, just as we can know if we're hungry. Say, let's use a really simple example. There are many other things I think that I can know in my body that aren't so simple, and that if I were to try and translate them into words, I would get into quicksand very quickly, right? If I say I'm hungry and I know I'm hungry, nobody's going to want to argue me. There's no philosophical, controversy around that. If I say I'm hungry, well, you could psychoanalyze me. Maybe I'm a food addict and so on. But outside of my own personal neuroses, we can assume that I more or less know, when I'm hungry, and whether I overeat or not is a separate thing. That the body itself does know when it's hungry, right? We can override that and we can interfere with that. And I think this is just a handy model that I'm just throwing out now, but that it does extend to everything. I do believe that we can know everything through the body, with the body as a point of reference. And by know everything, I don't mean as in we can have an encyclopedic knowledge of the universe, which is how I used to think of enlightenment as being. I mean merely that we can have a felt sense of what is happening in any given moment, at all the levels, from the most mundane and the most profane to the highest and most sacred or sacrosanct. And so somewhere in between, bread and God is the circus of conspiracy and what's going on in the world, the bread of the world, or rather the circus of the world. And I think that's the hardest realm to know. Like, it's easy for me to feel I know what's good bread and what's not good bread, like what basic physical needs, although actually that is quite hard. And it's easy for me to know that there is a divine presence in my life of transmission that is coming from some deep realm of my own being that is truly meaningful, my own spiritual orientation, let's say. Those are easier for me to know and feel sure about than the in-between realm about what's going on in this world. And I think there is something inherently sticky and trapping or imprisoning about this world. Of course, that's the Christian viewpoint. And this is it's interesting to me because it's actually something I've been thinking about just in the last few hours. How much my attempt to understand the world itself is a kind of trap that I really want to learn not to keep falling back into.
Yes, well, and many people flinch from that, retreat from it, or don't even approach it in the first place. I find myself experiencing some frustration, which is something I hate to admit to ever experiencing with other people. I don't think about it. I don't want to know. I don't care. Let's just talk about bread. Or on the other hand, let's just talk about God. So, and I've wondered about that. Is that wandering in itself? Is that questing a trap or a burden? Also, I do have this very strong feeling gleaned over my lifetime that we're here to learn, and that's a cliche in itself, but the phrase resonates with me in some way, that it isn't invalid or pointless or meaningless or fruitless to ask these questions or to look at these things, but it's just to be aware of the fact of what you're doing. Just be conscious about it, not to get lost in it. And I don't want to, from what I said prior to your answer, my previous question, I don't want to make it sound like I want to be equivocal about everything. There are certain things that I feel, like you, quite certain about, like actions have consequences, and that good and evil are concepts that we can grasp and that we can manifest, and that we should love more and hate less. These are things that I kind of have an instinctive feeling for, understanding of. So it's not that I'm kind of just saying like, anything goes and nothing matters.
Right.
Far from it. Just to take a sideways step, we've mentioned, well, social engineering is one of the key phrases related to your book. We've talked already about the realm of politics, economics, education, what have you. And we said early on that we'd talk in more concrete terms about some of these things, how they've been playing out in our society. So let's say something about Fabianism. say, just to put some meat on the bones, for people who don't know, whatever form it tends to take, if we leave aside totalitarian regimes, which in themselves usually tend to have a left or right flavour, in a lot of the politics that most people are used to thinking about, we have left-right paradigms, another phrase beloved of conspiracy theorists. But let's say something about Fabianism. You just explain to people in the context of your book why this is important, and that will give us a jumping-off point for a few things we can discuss about how we found ourselves where we are now.
So the Fabian Society started with the Fellowship of the New Life, which was 1883, coincidentally the year of Marx's death. And of course Marx was in London at this time, as is known by Marxists. And but there's no evidence that I could find that Marx was actually directly involved with the formation of the Fellowship of the New Life or the Fabian Society, but certainly that the founding members of the Fabian Society were aware of Marx and were interested in his work. That much is pretty definite. So the founding Fabian members included Sidney and Beatrice Webb. George Bernard Shaw is probably the most famous. There was a spiritualist called Frank Podmore, and Havelock Ellis is another very significant Fabian. In some ways, probably the most significant in my research, because he was like a forerunner of Alfred Kinsey, like he was a very early sexologist and a pioneer in terms of researching human sexuality and using that research for formulating strategies for social engineering, let's say, or at least his work was used in that regard. As far as the Fabian thing, I guess one of the key elements there is what is Fabian. It comes from Fabius, who was a Roman general, Quintus Fabius, and his policy was to, as a military strategist, was fighting guerrillas, or rather fighting with guerrillas. He defended Rome from Hannibal's mighty Carthaginian army. His tactics involved gradualism and terrorism and delaying tactics. So this idea of, so he would starve out the enemy would be one obvious example. So the principle that the Fabian Society adopted from Fabius was of gradualism, of incremental change or progress, with, a long-term goal of conquest, ruling the world, would be obviously the broad stroke version of that, but of influencing and shaping society, towards a long-term goal, which I won't even attempt to try and sum up, via the infiltration of various key levels of society. So education would be obviously a primary one. Politics, they founded the Labour Party. Science, in terms of research, intelligence, literature, the arts in general, they were particularly active within the arts. One of the terms that they used to describe themselves was permeators. The idea of permeating society. So, and they were all wealthy, the Fabians, just as my family was wealthy. And therefore they already had a lot of connections, and so they would use those connections to extend their influence. They would, sow seeds through all the various different methods at their disposal, and they would convert, and then they would extend their influence this way. And I think probably the most compelling thing about the Fabian Society and their influence is that it's a soft influence, in that it's possibly, anyway, primarily through an ideology and a methodology, you could say. So that one doesn't necessarily have to establish that a given group or institution that is seen to have a huge amount of influence, such as the Rand Institute in the US, say, it is overtly or even covertly Fabian, but we can see the ways in which they have adopted Fabian ideas, methods and goals, then we could say that they have been Fabianized. And my view loosely is that the whole of Britain was Fabianized. It was successfully Fabianized. And to a certain degree, the fact that the Fabian society is almost unknown outside of conspiracy circles and among the elite, obviously familiar with it, is testament to its efficacy, I think, in terms of two main ways, really. One is that for something to proceed via covert influence, if it can do so and remain hidden, that's obviously testimony to its success. The other way is also more subtle, which is that if ideas can be implemented in society in such a way that they over time, incrementally and almost invisibly become the norm, they establish the ideological framework for a society, let's say, then they are by definition invisible, because they're just the fabric from which the culture is woven, so we don't see them. So I think that this is kind of useful to come back to that earlier point about Jimmy Savile and the thing you said about how the conspiracy, in quotes, this social engineering long-term plan that involves, countless groups and individuals and philosophies and all the rest somehow working together organically, that it's, although it does have a covert aspect, it also has, more surprisingly, and I think more predominantly or more significantly, a hide in plain sight aspect. And this relates to, how we are. It's a bit like the Jesuit thing. They give me a child from, until the age of 7 and I will give you the man. If you think of that at a society level, if you think of certain, factions installing themselves sort of widespread and deep level of society, as that society is transforming and growing and developing, then it's there at the very inception, obviously not the inception of British society, but the inception of a certain phase of British society we're talking about here, aren't we? Because there's sort of the Industrial Revolution and various other things that, were coming into form at that time. Obviously Marxism, Freudianism, psychoanalysis, sexual research, economics, what's his name? Maynard Keynes. Yeah, Keynes, he was obviously the leading economist of our time, and he was a Fabian, and so on. All these things are actually, they're being incepted as social movements, and so they end up really shaping, and obviously the Labour Party, that's shaping the society that you or I were born into. So we wouldn't necessarily see any of these influences because they're the same influences that have shaped our own capacity to perceive and to interpret. We just accept them as the norm.
Well, that phrase, give me the child and I'll show you the man, encompasses about half of your book, actually, and in some very disturbing ways. As we'll discover. But this line of thinking that we've been talking about, this attitude, this control freakery, what's the thinking behind it, in your opinion? What's the instinct? Is it simply utopian? Does it want the best? You come across to me, from what I've read of your work, similar to me, and so you seem like a live and let live kind of guy. And politically, I don't like labels for obvious reasons, but if I had to come down and select one from the, from the menu, I would say I'm essentially an anarchist, which is like, just do what you want, just don't hurt anybody and just leave me alone. But of course, as soon as you take that attitude, then you leave the door open perhaps for other people who don't have a live and let live sort of attitude. No, actually, I want to take command of this, and I think this is the way things should go. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that, as it were. So I just wonder, from your perspective, what drives this? And I think it is very deeply tied to formative experiences that individuals have. In fact, only today, when I was just going through my points for our talk today, did I look up the work of, now forgive me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but an individual called Lloyd Demoz, perhaps is how he pronounced his surname, an American psychologist. I was previously unaware of his books, on childhood and psychology and how all of that plays out in society. But I think that's got tremendous relevance. I think the world that we see around us, and the maladies we see around us, again, tying it very, very much back to not just theories that you have, but your own lived experience, are hugely influenced by our lives as children.
Yeah, and I think that that's a much safer route to take in terms of trying to understand what motivates these people, and well, I guess that mainly, like what they're trying to achieve, one can find out by reading the text. Like a lot of it isn't secret, as I show in Vice of Kings, although it tends to be couched, nested in a sort of deceptive context, such as the work of Bertrand Russell, which seems like it's written by a humanist, and somebody who's concerned about human beings, and is presenting a sort of cautionary tale. I'd say the same with Brave New World and Huxley. Are these books cautionary tales, or are they blueprints which the elite have been following, laid down early on and shared among themselves, and even made available to the public in such a way that most of us wouldn't understand the real intent behind them? So as far as the goals, I think that those are laid out quite openly in various different places and from various different sources. But regarding the motives, I think that, well, obviously one can try and extrapolate the conscious motives by analyzing the goals and the rationales, but I think it's probably less useful than where you were going there with Lloyd de Mouse, by looking at the kind of psychological formation that leads individuals to want to basically direct the evolution of the species at a sociological level. Like what would drive people to do that? And I think that the reason that this is a safer approach, besides, I mean, like, we don't want to take people's word for why they're doing what they're doing, because we do know that even from our own lives that we don't necessarily know why we do what we do, and our conscious motives are often concealing much deeper unconscious motives. So there's that. And so then how do we psychoanalyze, individuals that we've never met and that are long dead? Well, the answer to that is we can look at ourselves. We can refer to ourselves and our own psychological strategies and so on and so forth. So that's what I've been doing more and more through my work. I've been looking at these larger scale case histories, whether it's Whitley Strieber, whether it's movies, whether it's Fabianism or Crowley, and so on, and using them as a mirror by which to understand my own psychology. And then, as I'm able to proceed or make progress that way, then I can flip it around again and apply what I've seen about my own psychology to what I'm seeing in these, more large-scale cases. So then, what you're asking about in terms of why would individuals gather together in groups and try and steer the course of history with possibly the best of intentions, or even presumably the best of intentions? I think the answer, once again, can be simplified as Lloyd de Mouse does simplify it, although it's very complex, his database to trauma, to early formative trauma, and how that creates a split in us and a fragmentation that gives rise to a particular aspect of the psyche that is all about control. It's all about maintaining absolute control over its environment and others in order to feel safe. And that will come up with legions of rationales for that. And it's also very cunning strategically, like it's a survival-based persona, let's say, or it's a part of the psyche that gets emphasized. We can actually see this in again, just ordinary childhood, that children develop strategies to deal with the environment that they grow up in. They develop aspects of their personality that will that will protect them, and strategies of behavior that will give them as much advantage and as much control as they can within that hostile environment. So you can see that just throughout the world. If you just look at yourself and your siblings and people you've known, it's a universal human coping mechanism. And I think what I'm trying to map with Vice of Kings is how, when that is very extreme, when the trauma is extreme and it doesn't simply destroy the person, which is 99 times out of 100, in these 1 in 100 cases, the extreme trauma leads to the creation of a very extreme kind of diamond-hard sociopathic personality type, alter, that is incredibly sophisticated in terms of cunning, ingenuity, ruthlessness, patience, charisma, strategies that, or maybe not strategies, but qualities that, if combined with a driving ambition, which is also part of, an early trauma imprint, that we feel so insecure in our lives and so deprived of love that we'll do absolutely anything to gain a position of influence in society, or a feeling of being actually powerful and loved in some sense, or at least respected. You can see how all of these things could be, if they were combined in the perfect storm of a kind of, I guess it would be a kind of superego persona that really believes that it knows what's best for everyone, and that has the means to take charge, not only of its own life, but of everyone else's life, given enough opportunity, then it will do so. And I think, that's why I look at in Vice of Kings is, where it began is impossible to try and map, but that this could be engineered deliberately by people who were victims of this kind of trauma and driven and shaped in such a way to do so would then develop those kind of child-rearing, trauma-based practices that would then create the kind of leaders that they needed to maintain their hegemony and so on and so forth. And it would just continue exponentially in that way. But I'm wary of going too far with that, because then one does get into this broad stroke conspiracy theory. So my proviso is that this, insofar as I've been able to sort of speculate about that and to some extent I think map it on a large scale, it's only because I have recognized that in my own life, in my own psychology, my own trauma, my own coping strategies, and so on and so forth. Like, it's there. I can see it and I can establish it in my own life as part of the process of healing it and getting free of it, I hope. But it's still irrefutable evidence in that regard. Also, my brother's life, obviously, he was my first case study in this regard, really, because I was under his thumb. I was traumatized and bullied by him, but I also loved him very much, and I watched him destroy himself, and I needed to understand why, and so I kind of grew up seeing all of these different methods, philosophies, strategies, psychological principles, whatever, there's all kinds of different aspects to it, seeing them at play, but not understanding them, just being subject to them and largely a victim of them, but also complicit with them.
I'd just like to just take a few seconds out. If listeners would like to find out a little bit more about thinking around formative experiences, particularly childhood experiences, and how these play out in the lives of public figures, particularly politicians, and particularly in the UK, they could, if they go to legalizefreedom.com, they can find interviews, at least two of which I've done with Nick Duffel on his books, Wounded Leaders, also Trauma, Abandonment and Privilege. These are about the public school systems. They're very specific books, but they echo a lot of what you're speaking of, and they go into it in very specific detail. Picking up on a couple of things that you've just said, here we are airing our opinions in public, as it were, with a potential audience of almost the entire earth. So don't we want to change something? But I don't. I do what I do because I want to present thoughts and ideas to people that I would be grateful if they would consider, but I don't lose any sleep over it, if you see what I mean. I don't identify with it. I'd like to see the world evolve in a fruitful manner. I don't know how else to put it, but I've never wanted control over anyone's life other than my own. And so I put my thoughts to bed at night, literally, as I do myself, and that's it. I'm fine. I don't wake up screaming or in a cold sweat or anything like that, feeling that I need to change something in order to be fulfilled or justified or whole or anything like that. So I think that's wanting to discuss ideas, think about where we come from, where we are, where we're going, and engage with other members of the species is somewhat different to a compulsion to wanting to feel that you have control of yourself, your own life, in almost a religious way, molding people like yourself. So in order to validate yourself, because, that person over there to the left and that person to the right and that person in front of me and behind me, they're like me, so I feel better about how I am. And if they're not like me, then I need to change that because I don't feel that me being just me is sufficient or enough. In fact, it may be the opposite of that.
Well, it is a spectrum, as I'm always saying about just about everything. I think we exist on spectrums within spectrums, and again, back to this refutation of the conditioned, enculturated idea of us and them, of either or, of polarities. I don't think that that's a true perspective on existence. Even night and day, or especially night and day, are not polarities. There's twilight and there's dawn. And so in this regard, I think that, relative to a person's psychic wholeness or health, they will be, as you say, content with merely having dialogues and interacting with other human beings any way they can, in a civil and a respectful and loving way as we can, and that's sufficient. We will live and let live, But that I would say that's pretty rare. Like, souls of that sort of sufficient wholeness to really just live and let live are very rare in this world, and I think perhaps becoming increasingly rare. I'm not sure, because of course I don't know all 7 billion people, but certainly in terms of what we're seeing with, as we talked about, the increased polarization, so with identity politics and all that's going on in the world now, ideologically speaking, it does seem as though there is more and more runaway narcissism in our world, which relates to what you're describing there. I think the desire to actually turn everyone into a mirror of oneself in order to feel safe, and I think that is symptomatic of the sorts of trends that I've been mapping in my work, and I also say that I think one of the things that does make me somewhat qualified to write about this is that I am closer to the spectrum, to the end of the spectrum of this sort of sociopathic personality that I'm writing about than the other end, and certainly closer than I would like to be. I am somebody who's more likely to wake up screaming in the middle of the night, feeling I've got to do something. I used to believe I was the one, and partly from too much psychedelics, but I think mainly from the kind of traumatic childhood, rearing practices that I was subject to. I was raised within an elitist family, and I was traumatized by it in ways that I don't even remember. And I think that, and I know that I did really want to change the world. I wanted to, in a very apocalyptic way. I've also always been an anarchist. So my idea of changing the world, not literally, but if I had any kind of political affiliation, that would be the only one possible, because I always saw political institutions as inherently evil or whatever, malevolent. So my visions about changing the world were kind of anarchistic or destructive. Like, I thought that I needed to bring about the destruction of civilization in order to free the human soul. to be itself. And I even wrote a book about it called Matrix Warrior. And, what was my surprise in my late 40s as I began to discover that was all programmed or conditioned into me, and that destroying the fabric of society is what Fabianism and these other covert agendas seem to be all about.
So we're both essentially anarchists then. For me, that was always about letting the old order decay, as opposed to sort of, Sex Pistols' idea of like throwing dustbins through, high street shop windows or whatever.
Yeah, for me, it's more about passivity, actually. There definitely was nothing about, and I've never been passive. I've been overactive, I should say, but politically speaking, it was about just let the system, grind itself down to a halt. Because it's so inherently self-contradictory and self-cancelling and self-destructive and corrupt and all the rest of it. And it's been so apparent to me, and more apparent, that every attempt to fix it just created more problems. Every apparent solution created 10 more problems. It's like the Hydra. It seems to be like human society as a problem is like the Hydra. That we don't know how to live together as long as we're referring to mental ideation that is sourced in coping mechanisms of a traumatized psyche. We're never going to get it right. I'm convinced of that.
Well, that sort of idea of letting a political system grind to a halt is almost like laying a siege in a way, but, just sitting outside the castle waiting for them to run out of food. And it almost begins to sound Fabian in a way, doesn't it really,
Yeah, well, except that Fabian, they're very active. There's probably some overlap. It's like one of the things I've had to discover or acknowledge, the more I've looked into what I see as these counterfeit ideologies and philosophies and beliefs and all the rest of it, is that they do take a lot of truths. They take the truths and then they reformulate them, and they redirect them towards some distortion that is inherently deceptive, and I think that that's the most destructive aspect of all of this is that the truth has been so thoroughly co-opted and weaponized that most of us don't even trust it when we see it anymore.
Oh, I don't know if this was ever said by any one person in particular, but the best lies, if there can be a best lie, are partly true. I remember reading that. I think it was probably in a book by Giles Brandreth, actually, for one of the books he wrote for kids, about excuses for not having done your homework, which was like always include an element of truth in your excuse.
Well, that's good fiction writing, absolutely, of course. But I think some of the stuff I look at seems it's even more surprising and pernicious than that. It's almost as though actually you take the whole truth, but then you somehow just spin it in such a way, you emphasize aspects of it that shouldn't be emphasized, and you de-emphasize others, and you end up with, I suppose it's weaponized truth is now the cliche. It's like religion is the obvious example. Like, I think there's a great deal of truth in the gospel. I think the Christian tenets, personally, I think are probably true, even down to Christ and the incarnation. That's just me. I'm not going to try and sell that to anyone, but I do find real profound truth in those interpretations of reality, probably more than any other I could think of. But that doesn't make me a Christian. There's no way in hell, I don't think, that I'd ever become a Christian, because the emphasis is all wrong.
Okay, Jason, well, we're kind of running out of time for today, but we're going to come back in the very near future and complete our conversation with part 2 of all this. In the meantime, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we've been discussing your latest book, The Vice of Kings, How Socialism, Occultism, and the Sexual Revolution Engineered a Culture of Abuse. That's out very soon, widely available everywhere, all the usual outlets. Just before we sign off, perhaps you'd like to share with listeners details of your website, where they can find all of your writings, your details of your books, your blog, your podcasts, and whatnot.
Okay, thanks, Greg. The website is auticulture.com. That's AUTI culture.com. You can find all the information there about my recent books. There's also a weekly podcast I do that's there at the site. It's called the Liminalist Podcast Between. I do that every Wednesday, roughly. I'm also doing weekly live events on YouTube currently on Saturday mornings. That's West Coast time. And currently working on a series called Psychological Operatives in Hollywood, for those who'd like to just get some sense of my writing without taking the plunge and buying a book.
Splendid. Well, once again, Jason, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. It's fun. Let's do it again.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.